Good evening. All right. So, kind of a cloudy, dreary day, as they say. But Genesis is always exciting, so more interesting stuff tonight. I think you'll find it interesting. I certainly did. But before we get started, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your love. Thank you for all your blessings. Thank you for loving us enough, Lord, that you would be willing to come down here to send your Son, and him perfect and sinless, but yet he gave his life and died for us. Thank you, Lord, for that. Thank you for the creation. Thank you for all that you do for us, Lord. I pray the Holy Spirit would open our hearts and minds to hear your word tonight, Lord. May you be glorified and honored and praised. In Jesus' name, amen. So Genesis, obviously, as we've talked about many times, the book of beginnings. Chapter 1, as I think everyone knows, is on creation. So if we think about the order of creation, it's a little interesting. It's actually the heaven and the earth, and then light. Then the firmament was created, which we talked at length about. Then the dry land and the sea. And then the grass and trees. Notice that's before the sun, moon, and stars. So that's kind of interesting. And then the birds and fish, and then animals and man. So it's an interesting order of creation. It's not what most people would think it would be in. So again, it's interesting that God actually created the grass, the trees, all the plants before he created the sun, moon, and stars. So that's where we actually left off last week, was all of those creations, and at verse 13. So moving on to verse 14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And evening and morning were the fourth day. So now we see the sun, moon, and stars having been created. And again, it says, "And God said." So it seems that the materials were there. He had already created them out of nothing. And now he's speaking them into formation, or whatever, if we can sort of put it that way. So that tells us how God did it. But man has some interesting ideas on this, one of which that's very popular. And what's really heartbreaking is I was doing a lot of these studies, a lot of this stuff that's been proven false is still being taught today. If you go to high school textbooks and secular schools, and even in college textbooks, some of this stuff is still taught as if it were true. And they know it's not true, they just don't want to admit the truth. And one of those is the nebular hypothesis, which says that some 4 billion years ago, the sun ejected this tail or filament, and the material spun out and cooled and actually became the planets. Well, the scientific experts who've studied this, because of the size of the planets and the relative size comparing the inner and the outer planets, the angular momentum, the spin axis, for lots and lots of reasons, they've proven that this is absolutely, it's not true. It doesn't make any sense from a scientific perspective. And one of them, who sort of analyzed all of this information, made the statement, there is no plausible scientific explanation for the sun being the origin of the planets. So enough said. So in my opinion, God had already said that, just not in those words, because he told us how he created the planets, and it certainly wasn't from the sun. And I found it interesting. It made me think of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, where I think man is leaning on his own understanding again, and that always tends to get us in trouble. So back to the truth. So God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament." And it's interesting here because the word for light here is actually different than what we found back in Genesis verse 3 for light. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then he said, "Let there be light." Remember that? The word for light there is or, and it means light. It just means light. But here, where it says, he said, "Let there be lights in the firmament," the word is meor, which means a luminary. And that the ma, or may there at the beginning of that word, is called a locative prefix. And what it's doing is it's it's giving it a place or a location. So the word here for light actually means light holder or light bearer. So something that's giving off light. I'm assuming in Hebrew the same word would be used for flashlight or candle. It's something that's physical that's giving off light, whereas the light itself is a little different, as we saw back in verse 3 where God actually created the light. So again, we see God is still speaking all of this stuff in formation or forming it all. And I was thinking about this light holder or light bearer, and how Jesus told us that that's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be the lights in the world. We're not supposed to hide our light under a bushel basket. And I thought, what a privilege that he would give his creation, his kids, light that we can share with people and help them come out of darkness. So we too are light bearers in a manner of speaking. But again, looking at our slide here, we'll talk about this some more next week, because it's really interesting when you put the big picture together. It's interesting how we see created, which is bara, out of nothing, and then we see, like I was saying earlier, God said. It's as if he created these things out of nothing, and then he starts forming from what he created as you move through. And then here's the rest of creation, and you see where bara starts popping up here and there in some very interesting places, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight, but also more so next week. But did you notice 4 interesting things here about what God did? So he created the lights, and he said that they're going to divide the night from the day. Well, that's pretty clear. We kind of get that with the sun and the moon dividing the night from the day. They're going to be for signs. Well, what does that mean? They're going to be for seasons. We think we know what that means. And they're going to be for days and years. Well, that's pretty clear as well. And then also it said they're going to rule the day and the night, which means they give us light and guidance, I think. So those 4 things are kind of interesting, but it says for signs. Well, what kind of signs? What does he mean by signs there? And again, if we look in the Hebrew, the word is oth. And some of the meanings are a sign, a signal, a distinguishing mark, a banner, or a remembrance. And that's very interesting when you think about the Hebrew Maseroth, when you see that signs can be a remembrance of something. Psalms 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard." So we think of that as just saying that the heavens declare the glory of God and that it's his creation and only a God could create all that, and that's absolutely true. But some people believe that there's something hidden there, that God actually had given a message in the stars he created that actually outlined the redemptive plan. And it's an interesting theory by some scholars. There's a lot of information to back this up. The star constellations have been important to all cultures really throughout mankind. And that's where the modern day zodiac comes in, which I'm not into horoscopes. We're not going there tonight. That's not what I'm talking about. But this idea of zodiac and all this goes back all the way to the most ancient of cultures. Here's an example of one of the oldest ones surviving, which is found in Egypt. It's the temple of Dendera. And on the right-hand side, you actually see their zodiac on the ceiling of that temple. So we know that all these ancient cultures were interested in the zodiac and what was going on there in these stars. So as you know, the zodiac is made up of 12 constellations tied to how the Earth moves through space. And they actually mark out a path. It varies a little bit according to the time of year, but they mark out a path and run a particular course of the ecliptic. And as we know from both Psalm 147 and Isaiah 40, all the stars have a name. God actually gave all the stars a name, which is really interesting. The word zodiac actually comes from the word sodi in the root, which means the way. So why in Hebrew would the constellations, the zodiac, if you would, why would it be called the way? And some of these scholars theorize that the reason is because it is God as actually, there's a story that's being told there, and it's the way that humans can be saved. And it's also interesting, I believe it's 6 times, I only wrote down 5, but I think it's 6 times in Acts, Christianity is called the way. The religion back in the early days was called the way. And it's kind of interesting because should this be true, that idea, that concept actually goes all the way back to Genesis as to the way that God might provide. So it's kind of interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this. So there's 12 constellations with their decans, which is their associated stars or clusters. And it's interesting because the Mazzaroth looks at the stars in the order of their brightness. You know, you hear these stars and you hear Virgo is this woman and she has a branch and she has these ears of corn. It's kind of interesting when you think about that, because supposedly this woman is a virgin. And those of you who are with us for Zechariah and some of these minor prophets, remember we're talking about Jesus is the branch, and the words for branch, remember that? And remember when Jesus said that a grain of corn is dead unless it fall into the ground and gives new life. So there's some meaning these scholars think in there, and I found this fascinating. Again, I don't want to spend too much time about it, but they actually think that, you know, perhaps Adam, Enoch, and these guys after the fall, this may have been a way of teaching their children how God was going to provide a way. So we're just going to quickly go through these and just look at a few of them. Virgo, some of the meanings, the Hebrew meanings have largely been lost, and I wondered if that traces back to when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, because a lot of their records were, under Nebuchadnezzar, because a lot of their records were destroyed. Of course, it was destroyed in 70 AD too. They might have lost more then. So a lot of this comes from other societies' ideas of what the meanings of these were, which seem to be related to some of the Hebrew meanings, but maybe not necessarily exactly the same. So the reason I'm showing you these is because when we're done, I think you can see how a story could be hidden there. So just quickly, Virgo, seed of the woman, desire of nations. Libra, the cross, a price to be paid, a cross to be endured, a victim slain, a crown purchased. Scorpio, serpents or the serpent, the struggle with the enemy. Sagittarius, a double-natured one. Could that be the lowly one and yet the triumphant king? The dragon being cast down. Capricornus, the arrow of God springing up in abundant life. Aquarius, carrying the good news, bearing aloft the cross over the earth. Pisces, a crowned king, upheld and governed by the Lamb. A bridegroom exalted. Aries, the Lamb found worthy, a bride released and making ready. That sounds interesting. Taurus, the shepherd, invincible ruler, all-ruling shepherd. Gemini, marriage of the Lamb, the prince coming in glory. Cancer, a possession secured, a lesser fold, church of the firstborn, a greater fold, Israel. Leo, the lion, a king rendering, and the serpent fleeing. So again, there's some scholars who've written books on this stuff, and they've tried to research it and pull that story. But if you take the stars in the order of brightness, there seems to be a story hidden there. And I find that very, very interesting, because to me, that's, you know, we've seen so many hidden things in His Word. I just think it would be cool to think that God may have actually hid something in the stars that actually tells a story. Because if you look at the shape of those stars, it has nothing to do with these figures. There's got to be more to it than that. I mean, I think it's Cassiopeia is supposed to be this figure, and if you look at it, it's a W. It has nothing to do with it. So there's something there. So where these legends came from, it's kind of interesting. So that's a possibility that the stars could be a sign of the story of redemption that God hid there. But I was personally thinking about this, and I thought, you know, how many times, you all know I love eschatology. I love studying prophecy. So what pops into my mind when I hear signs, I'm thinking eschatology, right? And I thought, so if he put the stars and the moon and all these things, or the sun and everything's there for signs, could he be talking about, from an eschatological standpoint, signs? So I just started doing some word searches to sort of see what I could find, and I suspect that's one of the meanings of this, because as we look at it, in Mark 13:22 through 25, first of all, if we look on the right at our meaning of oath, we talked last time that it can mean remembrance or a miraculous sign. It can also mean an omen or warning. So as we think of signs in the sun, moon, and stars, which God clearly tells us here in Genesis, that's one of the reasons He created them. Mark 13:22 through 25 says, "For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed, see, I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars of heaven will fall, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. I would call that a sign in the end times, wouldn't you? Luke 21, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear, and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. And then lastly, one other one in Acts chapter 2. I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. So I think we're actually seeing these signs. I think we could actually, in a way, you could say that these prophecies that Jesus and these people are giving in the New Testament, you can sort of see they're actually rooted back they relate back, to Genesis chapter 1, where God says, okay, I put all these here and I'm going to use them for signs. And then we have to wait thousands of years to the New Testament, and we see one of the ways that there are going to be signs in the last days. So in a sense, it takes you all the way from Genesis chapter 1 all the way to the end of Revelation, where these signs are taking place. So, and then, there's lots that happens in the middle. I thought that was kind of cool when you think of it that way. So the next thing there that they were created for, though, was seasons. And that's an interesting word. It turns out, when you think about it, they do sort of demarcate our seasons, right? Because we know how the sun, it goes so far in the summer and the winter, and the shadows change and all this kind of stuff. So it does kind of mark the seasons. But that's actually a poor translation of that word. The word actually means appointed times, which is kind of different from seasons. I don't know why they translated seasons. It is true, they do kind of mark the seasons, but the word is actually appointed times. So what would God be talking about appointed times? Well, you have to remember his people and the law that's given in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all that. And some of these appointed times, one of the first ones was the Passover. Right, in Egypt, after all the plagues, and Pharaoh would not let them go, and then the firstborn is struck down, right? And we have the Passover, so they're putting this blood of this perfect lamb on their doorpost, and that was an appointed time, so to speak, that God was actually going to set them free. One of the interesting things about that, there's the 14th of Nisan on their calendar, but on our calendar it was Friday the 13th, which, believe it or not, that bad omen of Friday the 13th traces all the way back to Egypt and the Passover when Pharaoh and all of that business, which I was shocked the first time I heard that, because I hadn't actually thought about what the root of that would be, but it traces back to those roots for that. But what's really fascinating is, if you look at the appointed times God gave his people, the Jews, it turns out the 52 Sabbaths, which he instituted, and then you have the 7 days of Passover, and you have these other feasts, Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. You have the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the 8th day of Assembly. When you add all those up, you come to 70. And we all know about the heptadic structure of the Bible and how common 7 and 70 and all of this is. So just, it's really interesting how they are for appointed times that God appointed for his people. Because we've gone over these feasts. I didn't put the slides in tonight, but we've gone over them 2 or 3 times about how these feasts are all prophetic. The Feast of Tabernacles in particular is celebrating what happened in the past, but it's also looking to the future. And we know that the last 3 in particular are very forward-looking to both the rapture and the tribulation and what's going to happen. So these appointed times and even the signs in the skies, they're all interrelated. It's fascinating when you think about it and start to put it all together, how the story is actually laid out. But did you notice how I found it amusing how God mentioned the stars almost in passing? He says God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament. And here you're thinking, my word, man couldn't even make 1 star, and God puts it in as almost as if just this little passing thing. Oh yeah, and I made the stars too. I did some research. It turns out in our galaxy, they estimate there's 300 billion with a B stars. And I went to see how many they think are in the universe, and after 3 websites I gave up because they all agreed there's so many they wouldn't try to number them. And yet remember from that slide in the Psalms and also in Isaiah 40 where it said God has a name for each of them. So obviously there must be trillions and trillions or quadrillions or something of stars, and yet God knows them each by name. That in itself is just awesome in my thinking anyway. But when we think about it, so he made the sun, the moon, and the stars, and he made all of these things out in the our galaxy and all of these galaxies out there and all this. So obviously there's tons and tons of planets. So that then brings to mind, well, what's going on with all this stuff today with extraterrestrials and the people who believe in aliens and, you know, all this kind of jazz. So it turns out that a group of very highly specialized scientists gathered together in, I believe it was Switzerland, and they wanted to try and determine what the chances are of sentient life being on another planet somewhere in our galaxy. So the Green Bank formula had already been put together before their meeting, which defined the parts of, they thought, what would make up the likelihood that there's actually life on other planets. So N is the number of civilizations in our galaxy. R would be the rate of star formation. F to the P would be the fraction with planetary systems. How many of those have a planetary system? N is the mean planets with a life-capable ecology. F is the fraction on which life actually could occur. F to the C, fraction on which intelligent beings develop to a communicated phase. And then L, the mean lifetime of a technological civilization. So they get these highly trained genius guys together, and they start thinking about this, and they start putting in their numbers for these various things in the equation. And when they actually finished and they did the math, it came out, you know, in the circles of reason and mathematics, there comes a number that's considered the point of absurdity. In other words, anything that number or greater, it's absurd to think that it could happen because the chance is so remote, it is absolutely absurd to think of it as occurring. And when they did their math, guess what point they reached? It actually reached the point of absurdity, to where they just couldn't get it to work, that it makes sense that life could be on another planet. Which to me, they should have all woke up and realized that God is real, His Word is real, but you know how they are. I'm sure, to my knowledge, none of them actually woke up and realized that. But it's kind of interesting. The other thing, when you think about extraterrestrial life, if there were to be sentient beings on some planet out there somewhere, are they sinless? Are they sinful? My guess would be they probably would fall too, so they would have sin. So who's going to save them? Because we know Jesus, God's only Son, His only Son, became a man and died for us. God doesn't have another son to die for anybody else. So to me, we know that God is love. Now this is just my reasoning. You can tell me I'm nuts if you want. If God is love and He created other sentient beings, that would mean He would love them, right? Well, He only has one Son, and He chose for that Son to become a man to die for us. So there's nobody left to die for them. To me, that says they don't exist, because God is love. If they did, He would, you know what I mean? There would be two sons or something. I don't know exactly what. But to me, it just sort of, that in itself speaks against the idea of it being. I personally think all this stuff about extraterrestrials and UFOs and all this, I think all of that is demonic. I think it's the fallen angels and the demons up to their same old tricks that they were pulling back in Genesis 6. And they're trying to pull the wool over mankind's eyes, and Satan loves for us to believe a lie and the deception. There's a lot of Bible scholars that think the tribulation, that the lie, you know, if you read through, it talks about mankind being deceived by the lie, not a lie, the lie. And a lot of scholars think that the lie has something to do with this whole notion of extraterrestrials and UFOs, and we were seeded here by this other civilization and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be interesting, because we know that the vast majority of the world is actually deceived by the lie, whatever it is. But moving on back to our Genesis text. Then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament and the heavens." So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So the evening and the morning were the 5th day. So here we see the word bara again, and this is the first time we've seen it since the beginning. That's an interesting occurrence there. And also, you notice that they're all going to multiply after their kind. And if we think about DNA, it's a digital code. It's got to be according to its kind. Because if you can't put together animals that aren't of the same kind. Even if you forced it in a test tube, it doesn't work. The DNA is so different, it rejects getting together. Now, man has now gotten smart enough to actually splice things and is creating some, pigs that glow, and they grew an ear on a mouse, and they're doing some really bizarre things where mankind is actually forcing them, splicing them together. But naturally occurring, a kind will not cross with a kind. It just doesn't work. The DNA is just incompatible. So all the way back in Genesis, God was telling us how he set up this digital code and how it works. But, man, he's always got to buck the system. One thing I found really interesting here is I saw a commentator talk about this included the insects. And I'm like, what? The insects? So, I'm thinking this guy's crazy. So I look up the word, which you can't see in this slide, but I put it on the next one. Now you can see the word. And it basically means anything that flies. So it actually would mean the insects. So I looked up the word birds and the word bird and fowl, and they're all this word. So I don't know. Is this only the birds we think of as birds, or does it include the insects because they fly? I don't know the answer to that question. But in the Hebrew, it can mean insects as well. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And again, we have this word created, bara, and after their kind. I looked up the numbers of creatures. I thought it was kind of interesting. They estimate there's been 230,000 types of sea creatures discovered so far. But here's the kicker. They think that 91% of what's in the sea has not yet been identified. So can you imagine? I mean, it would be, well over 1 million different types of animals in the sea. And when you think about some of the tiniest all the way through the corals and the fish and the mammals and all the things in the sea, it's actually not surprising. There's about 8,600 different types of birds, so that was kind of interesting. And notice that God blessed them. This is the first time we've seen God bless any part of his creation, right? He said it was good several times, but this is the first time that we see him actually bless them and tell them to be fruitful and multiply. So again, as you think about it, and this is kind of interesting, if you look over Genesis, you see as you read from verse 1 forward, things are getting more and more complex. You have, if I can use these words, we start off with sort of this dirt ball and space, and then we get light, and then he starts working with water and the land and all this kind of stuff, and then he makes the sun, moon, and stars, which basically you could sort of think of as still kind of working with dirt or clay or molding something. But then all of a sudden it takes a dive up and you get the plants. And now we've taken another dive up, and now we've actually gotten animals. So as you think about it, as you move through Genesis, things are getting of a higher and higher complex order. And it would take more and more intelligence to actually design them, because it's becoming a very, very sophisticated system. And one of the fallacies of creation is this idea of the simple cell. And actually, I've seen multiple scientists quoted that if Darwin understood what he called a simple cell, in today's terms of what we know, he may have never even came up with a theory, because it's ridiculous, because there's no such thing as a simple cell. A simple cell, what's called a simple cell, is actually almost like a little city in and of itself. There's thousands of enzymes and proteins. They're all dependent on one another. If you start taking out any of these major things, the thing would die. And as it's been said many, many times, dead animals don't evolve. I mean, it's like some of these mistakes, you can't make them, because then you're going to lose your entire line. So evolution makes no sense. I always have a hard time arguing against evolution, because it's so stupid. I can't wrap my mind around it enough, you know what I'm saying, to argue against it, because to me it's just so stupid because things are so intricate. That may be because, obviously I minored in biology in college and medical school and all this different stuff. I mean, you see how intricate and how beautifully balanced all this stuff is, and it's just ridiculous to think that it just happened by chance, you know what I mean? But over on the left-hand side, there's a cilia or flagellum, which you see which some of these single-cell creatures use to move, and that thing is almost like a little motor. And what's really interesting is when they looked at these parts, they realized if any one part is missing, it doesn't work. It's like a mouse trap, the law of, I forget what it's called, but a mouse trap is one of the simplest of mechanisms, but if any one part is missing, it doesn't work. And if any part of this is missing, it doesn't work. It's an all or none phenomena. It's either there and it works, or it's not there and it doesn't. That leaves how much room for evolution for this thing to have evolved? It leaves zero room for it. It all had to be there at once to actually work. So that's one of the proofs, and that's just simple cells. As we start thinking about the cells in our bodies, you talk about complex. It is unbelievable. They're like little miniature cities that are kind of self-contained to some degree. Again, thousands of enzymes and proteins which are, carrying on these different reactions and making things happen. It has a protective covering, which is the cell membrane. It has food intake, vitamin intake system so that it can take in food. It has signal processing units. It has a central memory bank, which is the DNA, which it can self-replicate. It has information processing centers. It also has information centers for those to be converted to proteins. So it takes the information from the nucleus, takes this messenger RNA, and then it reads that RNA, gets the code from it, makes a protein, which then folds and goes out and does whatever it's going to do in the cell. It may become part of the cell, may become a part of an enzyme or whatever. So you have these sites. The mitochondria serve as the power plants, making ATP the energy for the cell. And the Golgi apparatus acts as a processing, packaging, and shipping center to export things out of the cell. It has mechanisms for trash and toxin disposal. And again, remember, this is self-repairing to some degree. It can repair itself, right? I mean, we get a cut on ourselves, the cells start repairing themselves, building new ones and all this stuff. And it's also self-replicating. It can actually duplicate itself. When you think about that, how in the world could that possibly evolve? It's absolutely impossible. Michael Denton in 1986, this guy, believe it or not, is a biochemist and author, and he's agnostic. He rejects biblical creationism. But even though he rejects biblical creationism, he made the statement, although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up of 100 billion atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. He may not believe in biblical evolution, but he just spoke that there's a God. At least in my opinion, he did. You know what I mean? And he's absolutely spot on. Because when you think about even a simple cell, you take a watch or a car out in the parking lot, they're nowhere near as complicated as a cell is. And yet we're supposed to think that a cell evolved. How many people could you convince that your car, I just found it, it just evolved? Just happened, to, the rubber and all this kind of things. It's ridiculous, it really is ridiculous. But thinking about evolution, it's always great to think of some of God's designs and how unique they are. And to me, again, just further proving how ridiculous evolution is. One interesting one is the woodpecker. For some reason, all of the Bible commentators want to talk about the woodpecker. So I thought, okay, we'll talk about the woodpecker too, because apparently people must really like this. It's a fascinating creature, it really is. It has a special cartilage between its beak and head to pad that blow when it's actually banging its head against the trees. So a special cartilage there acts as a padding. It also has a special, we have cerebrospinal fluid, which is basically a little thicker than water, but pretty much like water. Not theirs. They have a special type of cerebrospinal fluid which acts as a padding or a buffer when that brain is being jolted by all of those things. And this is really, I learned a lot, by the way, in this. The woodpecker's tail feathers, it can actually spread, and with its legs, it gives it a tripod. So when it's standing on the side of a tree, the tail almost acts a little bit like a leg, or a brace would be a better word, to brace the bird, which is kind of interesting. And their toes, which you can kind of see in the basic example there, most birds have what they call the 3+1. They have 3 toes and then 1 coming out the back. The woodpecker doesn't. The woodpecker has 2 and 2. And again, it's to grip the side of that tree to hold on better. And this was really interesting. The tongue has special barbs on it, so that when it goes in to get the larva out of the wood, the barbs are going to catch the larva, and it has a special glue on its tongue. And this glue doesn't stick to the woodpecker's throat and all, but yet the larvae stick to it on its tongue. So that's a pretty interesting piece of biochemistry, isn't it, to make such a thing as that. And the other thing, the interesting thing about this tongue, and I did not know this, is just how long a woodpecker's tongue is. Their tongue actually goes through their throat, wraps up behind their head. Some species, it then curls behind the eye or curls behind the ear. Or in this one, you can see it goes up and curls across the top of the head and back around. Because when you think about it, they're doing these holes, but then that tongue can shoot through the hole that they just made, plus the hole of the larva to get in there to where the larva actually is. So when you think about all of these special features the woodpecker has, how would you evolve those? First of all, how would you know, evolution is going to say, okay, woodpeckers are going to eat larvae and they're going to get them out of trees, but they're going to have to peck through the trees to get to the larva. So what do I need to do to evolve this woodpecker? Okay, we're going to do this with the feathers, we're going to do this with the feet, we're going to do this with the tongue, we're going to have a special glue. Come on. It just reaches the point of ridiculousness. Another one interesting thing is the golden plover, which is a little bird that one of the places they live is up in Alaska. And they need to fly from Alaska to Hawaii for the winter, right? So they don't freeze. So they need they put on 70 grams of fat to make that flight, but it turns out they actually need more than 70 grams of fat, and it's an 88-hour flight. So how do they make up the difference that they can't put on enough weight to make the flight? How do they make the difference? They use drafting. That's why when you see birds migrating, they're in a V. They're actually saving energy by flying in that V formation. And it preserves energy in them and makes their migration a little bit easier. Another interesting thing about the golden plover is the young hatchlings that hatch that year leave 2 to 3 weeks after the adults left. Well, guess what? They're not little babies at this point, but the young, they've never been to Hawaii. How do they know how to get there? Yet they always make it. And I was looking across some different things, and to this day, no one has figured out migration. They cannot figure out how these birds and butterflies and insects, how they know where to go, when to go. All of that stuff just remains a giant mystery to me, to me too. And I was actually thinking, that's so cool of God. In my opinion, it's like he gave them, these people that think they're so smart, it's like he gave them this enigma that they cannot solve, because nothing works. How could you know how to go somewhere you've never been and no one told you? So it's really, really interesting when you think about it. And then just one more. The bombardier beetle, as you can see here, this thing shoots the equivalent of fire out from this special apparatus that comes out from its abdomen. It has these mixing chambers, these special enzymes, these like tanks, a holding tank, and then a combustion chamber, and it mixes these chemicals together, and it can spray them. There's actually pictures. It can wind that thing 360 degrees, so wherever the threat is, it can actually aim it at that threat. If you think about evolution, this thing could blow itself up if it made a mistake. How are you going to get these enzymes? How are you going to get this system put together and never make a mistake? You know what I mean? Again, it's absolutely absurd. So to me, this is one of the coolest creatures to think that they can actually do this. And then when you think about a dolphin and their sonar, I mean, how are you going to evolve sonar? How would you even know to do it? And you think about bats and their sonar to identify moths and mosquitoes and the things that they eat. And another thing I learned in my research, there's some moths that have anti-sonar. I did not know that. They can actually detect a bat's sonar, and when they detect the bat's sonar, they fold their wings in and just go into a free fall. And fall long enough, I assume, that they think that it's no longer a threat, and then they start flying again. So we have bats with sonar, and now there's actually some moths that have anti-sonar. So how cool is that? You know, so God's creatures, you know, it never ceases to amaze you. But back to our text. So God said, let the waters abound with abundance of living creatures, and the birds, let birds fly. And he says this, every living thing that moves. And again, we talked about blessed, be fruitful, and multiply. So it's kind of interesting, this living creatures, because we think of plants as living, but plants, they aren't living in the same way animals are. I mean, they are alive in the sense that they could die, but they're not like an animal. And again, we talked about the digital code and all this kind of stuff. So why all of a sudden, in addition to God saying it was good, like he said many times, why now all of a sudden is he blessing them and telling them to be fruitful and multiply? I mean, he talked about the grass and the trees and all having seed, but he didn't tell them to multiply. You know, interesting, because it's probably just going to happen on its own, right? But yet he's telling these to be fruitful and multiply. Well, it turns out, if you look at this phrase, every living thing, the word in the Hebrew is nephesh. And it's the idea of something with a consciousness, something with volition, thoughts, or intent, and that can make decisions. You know what I mean? And we think about an animal, you know, when it's hedged in something like, you know, if a squirrel's going to cross the road and you see them sort of deciding, are they going to cross or are they going to run the other way? So something that can make decisions, it has volition, has a consciousness, and it came to be the word soul. Something that has a soul, in other words, a mind, a soul, where a conscious thought becomes involved. And it's interesting that God says it's good, and he actually blessed this. And I would point out to you, this is the second time, if you remember, that we saw the word bara. So we saw bara for the creation of what I would call matter. Now we've seen bara hasn't been used again. It's always been asaph or one of those other things for form. Now we're seeing bara again for the first time since those first verses, and we see something new coming on the scene, the mind or consciousness. So I thought it was kind of cool that as we follow this through. And obviously God was pretty happy with his creation. So we have in verse 24, then God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth according to its kind, and it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. So it's interesting, if you look at this, you sort of see he created the domestic animals, the non-domestic animals, and then all of the other stuff, you know, worms and critters and all those kind of things. So he delineates three types of animals, and I thought that's interesting because of how we use domestic animals, how they're sort of in a different category, and certainly they are in a different category. So I thought that was kind of cool. And again, each is after its kind. They don't cross well. Somebody asked about dinosaurs, so I thought I would just say a quick word. You know, these scientists keep saying they're going to clone a dinosaur. I don't know how they're going to do this, because they're going to need a cell that has the cytoplasm and the things to actually get the DNA to replicating. If they get the DNA to actually make a dinosaur, you've got to get the DNA to replicate. Just like a human cell that's, once it's fertilized, you've got to have the cell there for it to replicate, and one, you know, becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, and it actually forms into humans. So I don't know how they're going to do this, but they may have some trick up their sleeve where they use some animal cells to do it or not. I don't know. But my research over the years, not just for tonight, but it turns out that reptiles actually grow all of their life. You know, even in us, our some of our cartilage keeps growing. You know how men, as they age, their nose gets bigger, their ears get bigger. There's certain parts of us that keep growing. Well, reptiles keep growing through their whole life, although much slower probably than they used to, because in Adam and Eve's time, there would have been a perfect creation, right? And they were all over the world. Well, if you think about it, if reptiles grow all of their life, and we know that Methuselah lived over 800 years old, these animals could live a very long time. So something that doesn't stop growing could get very, very large. So that is probably what the deal with the dinosaurs is. They would get absolutely huge, and probably most of these the skeletons and bones and stuff they find are from the flood, where the flood wiped them out. Noah would have still carried 2 of each on the ark, probably babies, and but you would have all of these giant ones that would die during the flood and go down in the fossil record. And we talked about how they trick us about this fossil record stuff. And another thing I realized as I was doing a little bit of research on this is they kind of trick us with dinosaurs too, because they don't know what they look like. They have the bones, and they put the meat and the skin and stuff on there, what they think they would look like, but they don't really know. And this idea of them, you know, with these horrible teeth and eating each other and all that stuff, that's hogwash, because we're going to see God, everything was vegetarian in the beginning. God says every animal will be eating, you know, the herb-bearing seed and all this kind of stuff. So we'll see that. So I think that's what happened. And then after the flood, the conditions were not so good anymore, because we see man's lifetime shortened from, you know, 500 to 800 plus years down to 70 to 100 years. So their lifespans fell too. So they're not growing as much, and a lot of them just probably just plain out died out over time, because the conditions were so different before and after the flood. Anybody who's interested in more information on that, on the dinosaurs, I would strongly recommend this website. It's Answers in Genesis. If you just type in Answers Genesis, you'll find it, and they have all kind of cool stuff about Genesis and all. So we'll end there tonight. So now we've got all the animals created. So going back to knocking evolution, which I love to do. So not only do we have God creating the plants and the animals, but he has this intricate cycle to where they're interdependent on one another. If the plants would eventually exhaust all of the CO2 available and they would all die, they'd starve to death, right? Without what? The animals. The animals, without the plants, number one, would have no food, and number two, they would all suffocate because there would be no oxygen, because the plants aren't around to produce the oxygen. So you've got this interdependent system that would have had to evolve together at the same time. Well, how are you going to do that? And then just as I was driving here tonight, I was thinking about this slide, and I thought, that slide doesn't even include pollination, because a lot of plants can't even reproduce without an animal to pollinate them. So you got to have the pollinators, you got to have the things that plants make for the animals, you got to have the things animals make for the plants. So it's like you have this super intricate, complex system that's interdependent, and you can't evolve part without the other. Well, the whole theory of evolution is simple becomes more and more complex. Well, it can't happen if you're missing these giant pieces that these have got to have to live. So the whole thing is just absurd, as we talked about earlier. All right, so that's it for Genesis. Obviously, you can see I stopped just before man was created, so that's where we'll pick up, not next week because it's Valentine's Day, but the week after that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for such a divine and wonderful creation. Thank you for just the wonders of your creation, Lord, as we look at these animals and we look at the intricate systems and the cell and the different things that you made, Lord, and how wonderful it is. Truly, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, as is all of your creation, Lord. Thank you for telling us how you did it, Lord, to help us to understand it and help us to always give you the glory, the honor, and the praise. Lord, I pray that you'll just watch over each person here, bless them with the message you have for them, give them safe travels home. Help us to always look to you for the answers, Lord, because you are the answer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.